Have you ever wondered why most cyclists obsess over digital data while some of us find more clarity in a single vibration? For an autistic rider, a fixed gear bike is not just transportation, it can become a neurological extension, a stripped back steel frame tuning fork for the nervous system. We are removing the noise, the screens, the alerts, the compulsive little numbers blinking away like anxious insects, and asking what happens when the body receives feedback directly from the machine. This is not to claim that every autistic rider experiences cycling in the same way. Autism is not a single sensory setting, it is not high sensitivity mode permanently switched on, nor is it a neat collection of quirks ready to be turned into motivational posters. Autistic people can be more sensitive, less sensitive, or differently sensitive to sound, light, touch, smell, taste, movement, balance, internal body signals, and proprioception. Sometimes all in the same day, depending on fatigue, stress, environment, and the context around them. The National Autistic Society describes sensory differences as involving heightened or reduced sensitivity across senses, including the less discussed sensory systems such as balance and body awareness. In this video, I am not saying autistic people like fixed gear bikes, that would be nonsense. Instead, I am asking a more specific question. Why might the direct mechanical feedback of a fixed gear bike feel uniquely grounding for some autistic riders? The answer sits somewhere between sensory regulation, proprioception, rhythm, predictive processing, control, and the strange pleasure of feeling a drivetrain speak through your feet. Modern cycling culture has built itself a glittering cockpit of quantification: speed, power, heart rate, cadence, normalised power, training stress, vertical ascent, segment ranking, estimated sweat loss, sleep recovery, readiness score, battery percentage, firmware update required. The ride is no longer merely ridden, it is interrogated, translated, uploaded, processed, compared and quietly judged by a small rectangle strapped to the bars. For many riders, this is useful. But for some autistic riders, modern metric-heavy cycling can become another layer of sensory and cognitive demand. The city is already shouting, traffic lights blink, buses hiss, cars reverse with synthetic bird calls, pedestrians drift unpredictably, dogs lunge into cycle paths, potholes open up like little trapdoors through the road, a shop alarm screams, someone plays music from a phone speaker with the acoustic generosity of a wasp in a biscuit tin. Then the bike computer joins in. The problem is not simply too much information, it is too many competing information streams, each demanding interpretation. A neurotypical rider can glance at a screen, absorb the number and return to the road. An autistic rider may not experience the transition as clearly. The number might stick, the cadence might be wrong, the average speed might become irritating, the route line might become a command rather than a suggestion. The device that promised clarity starts producing cognitive load. Sensory overload is not just discomfort, it can narrow perception, increase stress, disrupt decision making and make the world feel less navigable. The National Autistic Society notes that autistic people may become overwhelmed by sensory experiences such as sound, light, smells, textures, or any other forms of input. In suburban cycling, the overload is not abstract, it is spatial, physical and immediate. Too much noise can become a safety problem. Too much visual clutter can make it harder to read traffic. Too much internal tension can turn a simple commute into a neurological obstacle course. This is where the fixed gear bike begins to matter. A fixed gear bike strips away not only components but forms of mediation. No freewheel, no coasting, no gears. Sometimes no computer, sometimes no phone mount. Sometimes, if you're especially committed to annoying both your knees and the comment section, no brakes. The fixed gear bike does not simplify the world, but it simplifies the conversation between the rider and machine. The bike gives you one ratio, one chain line, one direct loop of pressure and resistance. Instead of multiple digital signals, there is a single mechanical frequency coming through the pedals. It is not silent exactly, it hums, it ticks, it trembles, it mutters through the soles of your shoes. For an overloaded nervous system, that singularity can matter. The fixed drivetrain becomes a reset button you can press with your legs. Most bicycles speak in fragments. The freewheel chatters when you stop pedalling, the derailleur shifts the chain across sprockets, the suspension compresses and rebounds, Hydraulic discs whisper or howl depending on weather, contamination, and whether the bike has decided to become an experimental jazz instrument. A fixed gear bike speaks differently. It speaks continuously. Because the rear cog is locked to the motion of the wheel, the pedals never fully detach from the ground beneath you. The drivetrain is not merely transmitting effort forwards, it is transmitting terrain backwards. Every ripple in the road returns through the chain, crank, bottom bracket, pedals and shoes. The bike becomes a tactile sentence. The rider reads it through pressure. This is not romantic decoration. It fits with action-based theories of perception, where perception is not treated as passive reception, but as an active relationship between body, movement and environment. On a geared bike with a freewheel, the rider can pause pedaling while the bike continues moving. This is useful, sensible, and sometimes clearly a better choice, but it also introduces a small gap between movement and effort. On a fixed gear bike, that gap closes. The legs remain in conversation with the wheel remains in conversation with the surface keeps sending telegrams of grip, camber, grip, drag and danger. For some autistic riders, this tactile continuity may be easier to process than abstract performance data. A number on a screen requires symbolic interpretation. A vibration through the pedals is immediate. It does not need translation into language. It is not your cadence is 91 revolutions per minute. It is pulse, pressure, resistance and rhythm. That matters because autistic experience can involve differences in sensory processing, body awareness and interoception. Research reviews describe sensory processing differences in autism across external senses and internal bodily awareness. Though the exact patterns may vary between individuals and studies, the important point here is not that autistic riders magically have superior bike feeling powers. The point is that some autistic riders may find tactile and proprioceptive input more regulating than verbal, visual or numerical input. The drivetrain becomes a non-verbal data stream. Not data in the Silicon Valley sense, not data with a subscription plan, not data wearing a gilet and saying marginal gains at dinner. It is bodily data, chain tension, tyre resistance, pedal pressure, muscular load, balance, vibration. It bypasses the verbal committee and goes straight to the sensory parliament. Where the mind is scattered, the bike gives it a beat. A fixed gear bike can feel less like a vehicle and more like an added joint. The drivetrain forms a closed loop. Legs turn cranks, cranks pull chain, chain turns cog, cog turns wheel, wheel meets ground, ground pushes back through the wheel, cog, chain, cranks and legs. There is no coasting chamber in the middle, no little mechanical waiting room where the body can step away from motion. The result is intimacy, sometimes beautiful, sometimes rude. On rough ground, that intimacy can become even more pronounced. Tracklocross exaggerates everything. Mud adds drag, gravel adds chatter, grass adds suction, roots add surprise. A small rise in the trail becomes an argument with your gear ratio. A descent becomes a lesson in leg speed, nerve and regret management. For autistic riders who experience the world as unpredictable, this predictability of mechanical consequences can be deeply grounding. Not easy, but legible. Push harder, go harder. Resist the pedals, slow the wheel. Lose traction, feel the skip. Hit loose gravel, feel the drivetrain lighten. Climb into mud, feel the gear thicken beneath you. The world may be socially confusing, emotionally noisy, and full of invisible expectations, but the fixed gear bike offers a rare honesty. It does not hint, it does not imply, it does not say we should catch up sometime and then vanish into the fog. It gives feedback immediately. This immediacy can support proprioceptive mapping. Proprioception is the sense where the body is in space, and sensory guidance organisations often describe it alongside vestibular and interoceptive systems as part of the broader sensory landscape relevant to autistic people. On the bike, proprioception is not an abstract bodily sense. It is the difference between floating and grounding, between being a head dragged around by limbs and being an integrated body moving through space. A fixed gear can intensify the sense of bodily location. The rider knows where the feet are because the pedals never stop telling them. The rider knows where the rear wheel is because cadence and traction keep reporting back. The bike becomes a moving map of the body. This may be why fixed gear riding can feel unusually regulating. The machine offers predictable resistance in an unpredictable world. It turns movement into a sequence of reliable consequences. For a nervous system tired of guessing what everything means, mechanical clarity is not trivial, it is a shelter built from torque. There is a phrase, the attention economy. It usually refers to social media, advertising and platforms designed to harvest focus. But autistic attention has its own economy: limited energy, intense focus, sensory costs, recovery debt, and the constant question of what must be filtered out in order to function. A ride can either drain that economy or replenish it. A digitally saturated ride may ask the rider to process too much: the route, the speed, the traffic, the weather, the body, the social expectations of group riding, the performance comparisons, the little electronic oracle announcing that you are slower than last week's version of yourself. For some people, this is motivating. For others, it is a tiny bureaucratic office installed inside the skull. The Unfiltered ride proposes something else. Remove the screen, remove the shifting, remove the obsession with whether this is productive. Let the bike become one continuous sensory object. Let the ride be judged not by distance but by regulation, not by average speed but by whether the body can become more inhabitable. The question changes from how fast was I to did this ride help my nervous system settle? That shift is important. It rejects the idea that cycling must always be measured externally. It also rejects the idea that performance is only physiological. For an autistic rider, a good ride may be one that transforms internal weather. Anxiety becomes cadence, overload becomes traction, rumination becomes breath. The static of the day becomes a clean mechanical hum of a chain line doing its one job with monastic stubbornness. The fixed gear bike is not therapeutic because it is pure. Purity is usually just marketing with a shaved head. It is therapeutic when it is therapeutic because it is consistent and has a little repetition. Repetition is often misunderstood in discussions of autism. From the outside, repetitive movement can be pathologized as meaning or unproductive, but repetition can be communication, regulation, pleasure, exploration, pattern making, and control. It can be the nervous system drawing a circle around itself and saying, "Here, this is where I can breathe." Cycling is repetition with travel attached. Pedal stroke follows pedal stroke, the chain moves across the same teeth, the legs carve circles, breath falls into rhythm. The rider becomes a metronome with mud on their down tube. On a fixed gear bike, the repetition is intensified because the cadence cannot fully pause. Even descending, the legs remain in motion. The bike insists on continuity. For some autistic riders, this continuity may be soothing. Not soothing in the soft pastel wellness app sense, more like the relief of a machine room whose pipes all run in predictable directions. The repetition gives the mind something stable to organise around. That does not mean every fixed gear ride is calm. Anyone who has spun out on a downhill on knobbly tires while questioning every life choice since childhood knows that calm is not always the word, but even intensity can be regulating when it is coherent. A hard climb on a fixed gear is difficult in a way that makes sense. The resistance increases, the body responds, the cadence drops, the effort becomes total. There is no extra decision about which gear to choose. The problem is blunt, the solution is bodily. This can be especially valuable for minds that already carry too many simultaneous threads. Instead of branching choices, there is one comment: keep turning. The simplicity is not emptiness, it is structure. Once you have completed your climb and you're descending, you have to start thinking about skid stopping. And skid stopping is a ridiculous thing to have to explain to ordinary society. Yes, I slow the bike by resisting the pedals until the rear wheel loses traction. No, it is not the most efficient method. Yes, I know brakes exist. Yes, I have heard of knees. And yet, there is something neurologically interesting about it. Skid stopping requires commitment to a singular channel of attention. The rider must judge speed, surface, balance, pedal position, weight distribution, and available grip. The mind cannot wander far, it cannot rehearse tomorrow's conversation, analyse an awkward email, replay a childhood embarrassment, plan dinner, and worry about the future of the bicycle industry all at once. The skid demands a narrowing of consciousness. This is not relaxation, it is focused, sharpened into bodily necessity. For an anxious or overloaded autistic rider, that kind of focus can be strangely calming. The brain is not calm because the world is gentle, it is calm because the task is total. The action gives attention a job, the noise collapses into execution. This links to predictive processing. In broad terms, predictive processing framework suggests that the brain generates predictions about sensory input and updates those predictions when reality differs. On fixed gear, especially off-road, prediction and correction happens quickly and physically. The rider predicts grip, tests it and feels the result, adjusts. For autistic riders whose relationship to prediction, uncertainty and sensory difference may be complex, the bike offers a contained prediction environment. It is not socially vague, it is not full of hidden meanings, it is immediate enough to be trusted. A skid either works or it does not. That feedback is spectacularly honest. In many ways, a skid is meditation. Meditation is often sold as stillness. Sit quietly, breathe, empty the mind, become a serene little pebble beside the river of being. This is fine unless sitting still turns your mind into a haunted filing cabinet. For some neurodivergent people, stillness is not calm. Stillness can amplify internal noise. The body becomes too noticeable, the room too loud, the mind too fast. In these cases, movement may be a better route to quiet than immobility. The nervous system does not want to be silenced, it wants to be given a rhythm strong enough to gather around. Fixed gear riding can do this. The legs spin, always. The best synchronizes, the eyes scan the surface, the body keeps time, the internal tempo of thought finds an external match. Instead of fighting the speed of cognition, the rider gives it a drivetrain. This is where the unfiltered ride becomes active mindfulness. Not mindfulness as lifestyle branding, not mindfulness as an app telling you to breathe while harvesting your sleep data. Active mindfulness, attention anchored in sensation, repetition and immediate terrain. The fixed gear does not ask you to empty the mind, it gives the mind a wheel to turn. A geared bike can also produce flow, of course, so can running, climbing, swimming, rowing, skateboarding, BMX, dance, drumming, gardening or walking through a city with just the right playlist and a coat full of existential purpose. The claim is not that fixed gear bikes are uniquely valid, the claim is that the fixed gear has a particular sensory architecture, direct drive, continuous cadence, mechanical resistance, reduced choice, immediate feedback. For some autistic riders, that architecture may fit the nervous system beautifully. A good fixed gear ride reflects the rider back to themselves, but not in the cruel way mirrors sometimes do. It does not ask how do you look, it asks how are you moving. Many autistic people spend huge amounts of energy monitoring how they appear to others. Tone, facial expression, body language, timing, eye contact, conversational pacing, whether a silence is comfortable or socially radioactive. The self becomes something constantly edited for external readability. The bike bypasses that performance. It does not care whether your face is correct. It does not care whether your tone lands properly. It does not need small talk. The bike responds to pressure, balance and rhythm. It lets the body exist without translation. In that sense, mechanical feedback can become a form of self-recognition. The rider feels not an identity category, not a diagnosis, not a social role, but a moving body in relation to ground. The self is not something to explain, it is something peddling. This is where the phrase neurological extension earns its keep. The bike extends the rider's sensory field, the rear wheel becomes part of balance, the chain becomes part of rhythm, the tyre contact patch becomes part of attention. The rider does not vanish into the machine, the rider becomes more locatable through it. This is the beauty of the fixed gear bike. By reducing mechanical complexity, it expands sensory intimacy. As we delve into cycling culture, we'll discover that many people love rankings. So cycling culture ranks riders, bikes, components, tyres, routes, frame materials, sock height, tan lines, valve alignment, and probably the moral worth of bottle cage bolts if left unsupervised. But for the unfiltered ride, performance needs a different metric. A good ride is not necessarily the fastest ride, it is not necessarily the longest. It may not produce a heroic GPS trace or a dramatic elevation profile. It might be 10 miles of urban edge, canal path, rough tarmac, industrial back road, and one muddy cut through behind a retail park that smells faintly of wet cardboard and the decline of civilization. But if the ride helped regulate the nervous system, it has succeeded. The performance metric becomes sensory quality. Did the bike provide reliable feedback? Did cadence settle thought? Did the terrain become readable? Did the body feel more integrated afterwards? Did the ride reduce overload rather than add to it? Did the machine become a bridge between inner processing and outer world? This does not mean abandoning athletic ambition. Autistic riders can care about speed, racing, training, distance, and skill like anyone else. Physical activity and exercise interventions for autistic people are an active area of research, with research suggesting potential benefits across areas such as motor skills, behaviour, social outcomes, and well-being, while also noting variability in evidence and the need for careful interpretation. But the point here is that performance can include regulation. The nervous system is not separate from the ride, it is the rider. A ride that leaves you grounded has done something more important than any Strava metric. It would be tempting to end with a grand declaration that the fixed gear bike is the ideal autistic bicycle. That would be neat, marketable, but wrong. Some autistic riders will hate fixed gear bikes. There is too much resistance, too little flexibility, too much bodily demand, too much risk, too much vibration, too much uncertainty on descents. Some will prefer an e-bike, a full sus, a Dutch bike, a cargo bike, a recumbent, a folding bike, a BMX, a touring bike, bike on a turbo trainer, or even no bike at all. Sensory regulation is not one size fits all, it is closer to building a personal weather station from nerves, habits, preferences, history, and context. The fixed gear is not the answer, it is an answer. For those it fits, it offers a rare combination: tactile clarity, repetitive rhythm, predictable resistance, reduced decision load, and a direct relationship between action and consequence. It turns the ride into a readable system. It gives the rider a way to meet the world through mechanics rather than through social interpretation. That is not a cure, it is not a hack, it is not inspirational content, it is a relationship between body, machine, and environment.